Thank you for joining us today on Rainfall. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. The International Court of Justice has issued its historic advisory opinion, making clear that all states are obligated under international law to protect the global climate system. In its opinion, the World Court held that states failing to honor their climate obligations commit an internationally wrongful act. The court affirms that every person has a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which is a prerequisite for enjoying fundamental rights such as life, health, food, water, and housing. States cannot meet their existing human rights obligations unless they also protect the environment, the court says. Today on the program, we'll look at what this means for everyone, starting from here in Lagos. Just stay with us.
Flooded homes, destroyed properties are what are left for many after over 12 hours of continuous rainfall that triggered flash flooding in parts of Lagos during the first weekend in August. The residents of Lagos are faced with increasingly severe annual flooding of their state, which is threatened by sea level rise and sinking at a rate of up to approximately 87 millimeters per year. The ability of this sinking state to cope with flooding is significantly hampered by poorly maintained waterways and drainage systems. Lagos is rapidly expanding as the population grows and people flock from rural areas towards urban centers in hope of better economic opportunities. People living in the coastal communities across the Lekki-Ekpe Expressway know too well the dangers of rising sea level. Erosion in Okun Alpha and other neighboring coastal communities along Lekki-Ekpe Expressway is not news. Unfortunately, a former president's visit has not solved the problem. Instead, every year, residents have seen large portions of their lands washed away by the ocean. Eco-Atlantic City, a 20-minute drive from Okun Alpha community on the new coastal road, and locations closer to it for years have been protected by groins. But the Lagos State government says the sheer scale of the challenge to stretch the usage along the 180-kilometer shoreline presents a significant financial burden. It costs a huge amount to construct a single groin, the state says. And with a targeted 180 kilometers coastal stretch, the projected cost exceeds 300 trillion naira, a figure that makes it clear that strategic collaboration is required. Flooding in Lagos results in damage and destruction of critical infrastructure, homes, small businesses, schools, markets, roads, water facilities, communication networks, health centers, electric power poles, and other public infrastructure at an estimated cost of more than $22.2 million each year. Today, many victims of climate disaster across Nigeria, and indeed the world, call the World Court on their side.
Turning to the relevant scientific background, the court notes that the consequences of climate change are severe and far-reaching. They affect both natural ecosystems and human populations. These consequences underscore the urgent and existential threat posed by climate change.
Driven by a 6-year campaign initiated by the Pacific Island students fighting climate change, who, when faced with the existential threat of sea level rise, sought legal clarity on climate obligations through the world's highest courts. Their demands were supported by a coalition of civil society, indigenous peoples and states.
Please be seated.
The court's advisory emphasizes that states have legal obligations to protect the environment and uphold human rights in the face of climate change, particularly concerning coastal communities. Sea levels rose at the rate of 1 to 2 millimeters per year in the last century, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The current rate is about 3.7 millimeters annually. The primary cause is climate change brought on by human activities, which constantly warms and thereby expands the ocean and melts glaciers and land-based ice sheets.
Unanimously is of the opinion that state parties to the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer and to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete ozone layer and its Kigali Amendment, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the United Nations Convention to combat desertification in those countries experiencing serious drought and or desertification, particularly in Africa, have obligations under these treaties to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Unanimously is of the opinion that state parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea have an obligation to adopt measures to protect and preserve the marine environment, including from the adverse effects of climate change, and to cooperate in good faith. Unanimously is of the opinion that states have obligations under international human rights law to respect and ensure the effective enjoyment of human rights by taking necessary measures to protect the climate system and other parts of the environment.
In its opinion, the International Court of Justice recognizes the interdependence between human rights and the protection of the environment. The court treats the right as fairly grounded in international, regional, and national law, pointing to its widespread recognition by the United Nations resolutions, human rights treaties, and more than 100 constitutions. The International Court of Justice's first ever advisory opinion on climate change contained a particularly strong position on fossil fuels that surprised even veteran observers of international law. The unanimous decisions went further than expected.
I note the presence of His Excellency Philemon Young, President of the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly in the Great Hall of Justice today.
With the court spelling out what responsibilities states have to protect the climate from planet-warming emissions from burning fossil fuels.
As regards question A, put by the General Assembly, A, unanimously, is of the opinion that the climate change treaties set forth binding obligations for states parties to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. These obligations include the following. A, state parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have an obligation to adopt measures with a view to contributing to the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change. B, state parties listed in Annex 1 to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have additional obligations to take the lead in combating climate change by limiting their greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing their greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs. C, state parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have a duty to cooperate with each other in order to achieve the underlying objective of the Convention. D, state parties to the Kyoto Protocol must comply with the applicable provisions of the protocol. E, state parties to the Paris Agreement have an obligation to act with due diligence in taking measures in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities capable of making an adequate contribution to achieving the temperature goal set out in the agreement. F, state parties to the Paris Agreement have an obligation to prepare, communicate, and maintain successive and progressive nationally determined contributions which, inter alia, when taken together, are capable of achieving the temperature goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. G, state parties to the Paris Agreement have an obligation to pursue measures which are capable of achieving the objectives set out in their successive nationally determined contributions. And H, state parties to the Paris Agreement have obligations of adaptation and cooperation, including through technology and financial transfers, which must be performed in good faith.
The court reinforces the principle that any conduct, whether action or omission, by a state organ is attributable to the state itself. It goes on to specify that a state's failure to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, including through fossil fuel production, consumption, licensing or subsidies, constitutes such an internationally wrongful act. Litigation against fossil fuel projects is growing, but so too are legal challenges by states and companies using the courts to block or unwind action on climate change. Fossil fuel companies and oil and gas producing nations could ignore the ICJ, but that raises legal and litigation risks of its own, says environmental law experts. But they say the court's opinion could be used in a lawsuit against expanding a coal mine, a private dispute between an investor and a state, or a contract negotiation involving a fossil fuel financier. This could particularly be the case in countries that can adopt international law directly into their constitutions and legal frameworks, though this will depend on national context and take time to trickle down. In these countries, which include France, Mexico, and the Netherlands, courts may have to take the ICJ opinion into account when hearing a case against an oil and gas venture. Even in so-called dualist states, where international law is not automatically incorporated, constitutional courts and other national legislatures often respect and adopt aspects of ICJ opinion, experts say.
The advisory opinion will be very powerful within states to be used by people taking cases against their governments. And we're already seeing that all over the world as one of the main ways people are trying to get action on climate change is by going through the courts. So every court, this will be something they can use, whether it's a municipal level court or a state level court. They will be able to use this new ruling to try to make governments be more accountable and do more. And so we've seen some quite successful cases, as we know, in Europe and the states that have already done this. But I think this advisory opinion will result in strengthening of all those cases and creating a whole new plethora of cases as well. It will also be a game changer for this whole climate discourse we're going through. We've been going through for 30 years, so it'll shift. It'll shift the narrative, which is what we need to happen.
Furthermore, the offending state must continue to fulfill the breached obligation and, where applicable, cease the harmful conduct, offer guarantees of non-repetition and provide full reparation, including restitution, compensation and satisfaction to injured states, provide a sufficiently direct causal link to the harm can be established under the rules of state responsibility. The court further determined that any breach of obligations related to loss and damage from climate change must be assessed under the established customary international law rules on state responsibility.
And so you need to be able to ensure that we can have a future that's much better or more resilient than we have now as a result of what you've done to us. And so that means mitigation on your side, obviously, but also adaptation for us, helping us build these resilient economies, the resilient public infrastructure, that kind of thing. But also increasingly we're dealing with loss and damage. So being able to compensate us for that loss and damage that we're already experiencing.
By saying that all countries were firmly bound to a swath of legal obligations under existing laws and treaties, experts say the ruling will influence courts, climate negotiations, and policy decisions across the world. On Friday, the 31st of March 2024, as climate advocate Cynthia Onuhi sits on a beach in Australia, breathing in the sea breeze, she's reminded of her home and childhood back in the Solomon Islands.
So I grew up in the remote part of Solomon Islands. I was surrounded by the environment a lot. I was in the sea after school, had to cross the sea to go to school. And during lunchtime, we usually fish for our own lunch. So we would catch about maybe one if we're lucky. Sometimes when we're very lucky, we get 4. But it depends on if you're willing to be patient for the fish to bite the hook. So being here on the beach really brings back those memories and kind of re-emphasize for me, you know, sort of the reason why we're doing this, why this initiative is very important. It's because of what we've experienced as child and children, and we want our children to be able to do that.
Like many Pacific Islanders, she grew up with the ocean. Her culture and heritage intertwined with the nature around her. But now, with rising sea levels threatening to erase the islands and the stories she grew up with, she likens the potential loss of her culture to sand slipping through her fingers and is left wondering what will be left of her children. Disheartened about the lack of change happening, Cynthia and 26 other law students banded together in 2019 and started a campaign to bring climate change to the world's top court and asked the International Court of Justice to define the obligation of states to combat climate change.
I now give the floor to Ms. Cynthia Honiwuni. Madam, you have the floor.
On the 2nd of December 2024, Cynthia addressed the International Court of Justice.
When the Paris Agreement was concluded, the youth of the world looked up to it as an instrument of hope. Today, the entire COP process has been hijacked by large emitters and major fossil fuel producers, turning it into a polluter-safe harbor and a trap for everyone else. No good faith understanding of the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement can be consistent with the conduct of large emitters. By depriving the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and COP process of any good faith, meaning these states have turned all 3 against their spirit. For my people and for the world's youth and future generation, the consequences are existential. As judges of the World Court, you possess the power to renew the power to help us course correct and renew hope in humanity's ability to address the greatest challenge of our time. And you can do this simply by applying international law to the conduct responsible for climate change.
Overall, states' positions during their oral interventions can be roughly segmented into 2 groups. On the one hand, many countries, especially, but not only developing and low-emitting countries, argued that the Paris Agreement does not represent the sum total of state obligations on climate change, and that customary no-harm rule and human rights law creates additional, further-reaching obligations. Many of these states also invoked direct human rights impact, emphasizing the right to a healthy environment and the rights of indigenous peoples and vulnerable groups. These and other rights, they argued, should apply territorially. They additionally invoked risks to their territory, statehood, and culture, and the right to self-determination, emphasizing enduring colonial legacies, development needs, and the impact of debt burdens and unchecked corporate and investor power. They drew on international environmental law
The SDGs carry with them responsibilities and obligations for states at both international and national levels. And it is of the utmost importance that the Court takes this into consideration. An analysis of climate change law that does not take into account the wider sustainable development agenda may lead to conclusions that would upend carefully negotiated international and domestic consensus positions that have taken many years to develop. Climate change cannot be elevated above or separated from other sustainable development imperatives and obligations through a silo-based approach to state responsibility. Furthermore, the preamble to the Paris Agreement acknowledges that human rights should be considered when taking action to address climate change, especially when it comes to the protection of the rights of most vulnerable persons, which includes local communities, women, and children. We also recognize that international climate change policy and law have to accommodate other emerging international legal norms, such as the right to development. While South Africa fully recognizes that there are numerous legal instruments that have relevance, we submit that it would be most appropriate for the Court to apply the Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement in answering the questions placed before it.
By contrast, several high-emitting and developed states focus on contesting the existence of binding international legal obligations to mitigate their emissions or provide reparations. To do so, they repeatedly emphasize the importance of continuing political negotiations and the carefully negotiated but easily destabilized solutions thereby achieved so far.
The law as it stands today requires states and others to take meaningful action to address climate change. We are not asked to make new law. This is neither your task nor your competence. You are, though, asked to advise both on the obligations of states under international law and on legal consequences under those obligations for states whose acts and omissions have, over time, caused significant harm. Your opinion should, therefore, in Albania's view, address the responsibility of states, including with regard to obligations to address and regulate conduct, both action and inaction, that causes or would cause significant harm to the climate system or part of the environment. You are asked, in declaring the law as it is, to bring a clarity to the law that will both allow and require states to take the action required of them and require accountability for failure to do so.
This is the biggest case in the International Court of Justice's history and seen as the most consequential in a recent string of landmark climate moves. The United Nations had tasked the 15 judges at the International Court of Justice, a United Nations court in The Hague that adjudicates disputes between nations, to answer two fundamental questions. First, what must states do under international law to protect the environment from greenhouse gas emissions for the future? And the second, what are the consequences for states whose emissions have caused environmental harm, especially to vulnerable low-lying island states?
As regards question B, put by the General Assembly, unanimously is of the opinion that the breach by a state of any obligations identified in response to question A constitute an internationally wrongful act entailing the responsibility of that state. The responsible state is under a continuing duty to perform the obligation breached. The legal consequences resulting from the commission of an internationally wrongful act may include the obligations of A, cessation of the wrongful actions or omissions if they are continuing, B, providing assurances and guarantees of non-repetition of wrongful actions or omissions if circumstances so require, and C, full reparation to injured states in the form of restitution, compensation, and satisfaction, provided that the general conditions of the law of state responsibility are met, including that a sufficiently direct and certain causal nexus can be shown between the wrongful act and injury.
Courts have become a key battleground for climate action as frustration has grown over sluggish progress toward curbing planet-warming pollution from fossil fuels. The Paris Agreement, struck through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2015, has rallied a global response to the crisis, but not at the speed necessary to protect the world from dangerous overheating.
The International Court of Justice announcement comes at a time of unprecedented climate upheaval, marked by extreme weather events and record-breaking heat. These impacts underscore the urgent need for decisive action and reinforce the importance of holding major polluters accountable for their contributions to this crisis. I'm Ayola Kasim, asking you to join us next week for another episode of the program. In the meantime, our inbox file@channelcv.com is available for all your comments and questions. From all of us here in Lagos, it's bye for now.